On August 29, 1996, a charter flight was just minutes from landing at a remote airport in the high Arctic. But instead of touching down safely, it slammed into a mountainside, resulting in the deadliest air crash in Norway's history. And the cause? Well, it all goes back to one single fatal misunderstanding.
So picture this. We've got a Russian jet, a Tupolev Tu-154, flying for Vnukovo Airlines. On board are 141 people. These aren't tourists. They're employees of a Russian state-owned coal company, Arktikugol, and their families. They're heading to these tiny, isolated Soviet-era mining towns, basically little slices of Russia sitting on NATO territory. For almost the entire trip from Moscow, everything was completely by the book. Just another day at the office. But as that plane started to descend into the thick clouds that were hiding the sharp, icy peaks of Svalbard, a catastrophic communication failure was about to set off a chain reaction, one they would never recover from. Okay, so this is where it all began to go wrong. It started with the very first radio calls between the Russian crew and the Norwegian air service. A subtle difference in how things are done, mixed with a language barrier, created the first tiny crack in this flight's safety. You have to understand this one thing, because it's at the heart of the whole story. The Russian crew was used to air traffic controllers, ATC, people who give direct orders you have to follow. But Svalbard didn't have ATC. It had an AFIS officer, which is basically an information service. Their job is to give you advice, like, hey, the wind is coming from this direction, but the pilot is the one who makes the final call. The crew had no idea about this distinction, and that assumption was about to become a deadly one. So the crew radios in. They're planning on using runway 10, which is a much simpler approach over the water. But listen to how they say it. It's not standard aviation English. It's just clunky. And that bit of ambiguity was all it took. The AFIS officer on the ground hears this weird phrasing and thinks, okay, he must be asking me which runway is active. So he just gives him the facts. Based on the wind, runway 28 is the one currently in use. From his perspective, he's just providing a helpful piece of information, a suggestion. And there it is, the complete disconnect. The crew in the cockpit hears the runway in use is 28 and thinks they've just been given a direct order, a command to change runways. But in reality, they were just given a piece of advice they could have totally ignored. This single misunderstanding, born from language and procedure, forced them to scrap their entire plan and rush into a brand new, much tougher approach. So you can just imagine the pressure that suddenly snaps on in the cockpit. They're scrambling, trying to reprogram everything for this complicated approach they weren't expecting, all while flying down into thick clouds and mountains. That kind of pressure, it just leads to more and more mistakes. It's a domino effect. Now, this approach to runway 28 wasn't just a simple straight line. No, it was this tricky maneuver called an offset approach. You have to fly down a valley using only your instruments, and then at the very last minute, break out of the clouds and make a sharp visual turn to actually line up with the runway. To make matters worse, this crew had never practiced this exact approach in the simulator. And they didn't do a new briefing. That's a huge red flag. And here's where it all falls apart. With no new plan, confusion just builds. The navigator, who happened to have the best English, is now juggling radio calls and trying to figure out this complex navigation. Overloaded, he makes a critical error. He punches the runway's heading into the GPS, not the approach course's heading. It's a small difference in numbers, but it means his screen is now showing a totally different flight path than the pilot's instruments. I mean, just listen to that. That's a direct quote from the cockpit voice recorder. That is the sound of total confusion. They're flying blind, their instruments are screaming different things at them, and nobody knows where they are. They know something is deeply wrong, but they can't figure it out. And still, they keep descending. So while the pilots are arguing, literally arguing, about whether to turn left or right, the plane is just flying. It's drifting further and further off course. In fact, they were flying parallel to where they should have been, but nearly 4 kilometers to the right, and heading straight for a mountain called Operafjellet. The last few seconds are just pure chaos. 9 seconds out, a warning light flashes for the terrain avoidance system. But crucially, the automated voice that should be screaming, "Terrain, terrain, pull up," it never goes off. A technical failure at the worst possible moment. A few seconds later, another alarm blares, and they finally slam the throttles forward and pull back on the controls. But it was just way, way too late. The plane slammed into the top of Operafjellet, almost 3,000 feet up. They were so far off course. And you can trace that deviation all the way back to that one single misunderstood radio call. 141 people, all of them, every passenger, every crew member were killed. For the small, tight-knit Russian and Ukrainian communities in Svalbard, it was an unimaginable devastation. People lost dozens of friends and family members in an instant. So, what did we learn from this awful tragedy? Well, the final accident report gives us a really clear picture of how a breakdown in the absolute basics of communication and procedure led to what we call a controlled flight into terrain, a perfectly good airplane flown right into a mountain. The investigation basically laid it all out. The language barrier kicked the whole thing off, which is why international standards for aviation English are so incredibly important. That initial confusion led to procedural mistakes, like setting the instruments wrong and not doing a new briefing. All of that caused a total loss of situational awareness. And finally, the crew just wasn't working together. They couldn't communicate effectively to identify the problem and make the one call that would have saved everyone. Just abort the approach and go around. And the impact was felt long after the crash. For the Russian community in Svalbard, this was just soul-crushing. The town of Pyramiden, already struggling, couldn't recover. 2 years later, the mine shut down for good, and the entire town was abandoned. It's literally a ghost town today, and this disaster was part of the reason why.
The story of Vnukovo Flight 2801 is just a chilling reminder of how absolutely vital clear communication is, especially when the stakes are high. It really leaves you with a pretty sobering thought, doesn't it? How many other disasters, big or small, all started with one simple misunderstanding?